Do you want the government deciding what is disinformation and misinformation and possibly muzzling you in your free expression online? Here's why this is important. Because if you can't express yourself freely, you cannot hold government to account. Government will work in its own little vacuum, and you'll stay home and be a good little silent taxpayer. You don't want that. This is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation podcast, where we are fighting for lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. I'm Chris Sims. I'm in Lethbridge, Alberta. Two of my favorite human beings, Franco Terrazzano, our federal director, and Ryan Thorpe, our investigative journalist. They're at our embassy in Ottawa. So this really... Okay, nothing says we care about affordability of the little people like jetting around Canada and eating lobster. What is going on with these so-called affordability retreats by the cabinet, and why are we paying for them?
Well, I can take that one away. Okay. So basically, over the course of a single calendar year, from September 2022 to August 2023, the Trudeau government held three-day cabinet retreats across the country. All of these were kind of pitched to the public as we're getting serious about the affordability crunch that you're facing. You know, we hear your concerns, we feel what you're going through. But thanks to some access to information records that we dug up, some other public records that the government has published, we now know that all told, they billed taxpayers for these affordability retreats $1.3 million, or just a little bit under $1.3 million. So and I think actually where the story really might get people upset is in some of the details. So let me go into those. So the first one, in September 22, they went to Vancouver. The menu, we were able to get our hands on the receipts. The menu that they were dining on included filet mignon, grilled Dijon salmon, ceviche, prawn ravioli, key lime pie. So they were eating quite good while they were there, and all told, they billed taxpayers for $471,000. Then just a couple months later, in January 2023, this time they said, hey, we're going to go to Hamilton. They dropped $305,000. And this is just from records that we got from the Privy Council office. So it's not even the total bill. It's $305,000 and counting. And this included, $32,000 on hospitality rooms, $20,000 on meals and incidentals, $50,000 on hotel rooms, $48,000 on meeting rooms. They had $26,000 worth of rental equipment, $71,000 worth of audio and visual services. And we got the menu. We saw what they were eating, and it was, lunch buffets, breakfast buffets. But my personal favorite, somehow over 3 days, they spent $3,493 on pop and juice. They spent $542 on potato chips and $240 on cookies, which, I don't know, that speaks for itself. And then August 2023, this time out to PEI, they dropped $485,000 on this 3-day retreat, almost $500,000, $100,000 worth of waterfront hotel rooms, and $75,000 in meals and general catering expenses.
Let me just jump in here for a second, because Ryan, you almost kind of buried the lead here, right? So they billed all of these 3 cabinet retreats to Canadians as affordability retreats, right? We're going to go talk to each other on how to make life more affordable for Canadians. And then they spent more than $1 million expensing the taxpayer for these 3-day retreats, right? Like, at the very least, they need to think about changing the name of these affordability retreats, because certainly us Canadian taxpayers can't afford them. I mean, maybe they should do a retreat about stopping pissing away money, but of course, even that would probably cost us, dear taxpayers, hundreds of thousands of bucks. So folks, they had these 3 cabinet retreats crisscrossing Canada, cost Canadian taxpayers more than $1 billion. More than $1 million, sorry. So a couple things come to mind. Like, number one, me and Rye Guy, we're here in Ottawa. There's offices all around us. So it's just a shame they couldn't do some of these meetings in the office buildings or over Zoom, which we're doing right now, to figure this stuff up. But number two, obvious, Canadians don't need you racking up more than $1 million on these so-called affordability retreats to make our lives more affordable. No, no, no. We need you to stop raising the taxes that are making our lives more expensive. It's that simple. You don't need $1 million billed to the taxpayer to figure that one out.
For real. I just wanted to add on to that because some folks who haven't like worked in government, they may not understand just how much they bloody well pay for it. So you guys are in downtown Ottawa. You're surrounded by government buildings, okay? The taxpayer already owns them. They are already wired for sound and video, in some cases like hardcore encrypted like video conferencing where they have to talk about important international stuff. It's surrounded by bars and restaurants. There are catering services that bring these politicians food. A good rule of thumb, especially for Ottawa politicians, is that if you see them traveling or eating, you're paying for it already. Even if they're in Ottawa, they're going to be charging you a per diem because they're away from their home riding, don't you know? So it just adds insult to injury for them at this time where I literally see people putting canned tuna back on the shelf because they can't afford it. These are working people. So it adds insult to injury when they decide to take it upon themselves to solve the affordability crisis while eating fancy food in Charlottetown and Vancouver. And so it's really Orwellian
with a tab, right?
Yeah,
and making you with a tab. Like it's one thing for them to use their $200K salary to wine and dine themselves. It's a complete other thing to go there, get these types of, filet mignon, the millionaire cut steak, a lobster tail or whatever, and then send the bill back to the taxpayer. Like that's the thing that really irks me.
That's right. And on top of this, so keep in mind, they're sending the tab to that hairdresser. They're sending the tab to the waitress, to the people working at the mall. And remember, it's this same government, folks, who will shake down those waitresses and those girls selling pants at the mall for their 50% employee discount. I'm not kidding. CRA will come after them and turn them upside down like a cartoon and shake them out for their toonies and loonies. Meanwhile, these cabinet ministers don't even bat an eye of traveling all over the place, spending your money and telling you to thank them for it. If folks are mad hearing this, you ought to be. Like, you should phone your member of parliament, I don't care what party they're in, and you should tell them to knock this stuff off. Because it's not only a big waste of money, it's insulting to the average working person. Do we want to have a little bit of fun? Do we want to move on to garden parties?
Well, you did say bars and restaurants.
Funny you should mention that.
Set the stage, Simmer, set the stage.
Okay, so garden parties happen typically, in my experience in Ottawa, at places like Stornoway or 24 Sussex. And so right now 24 Sussex is like under renovation. I think there's like tape around it or something. So there's Rideau Cottage. Quite often, political leaders will hold these little soirees in the spring and summer, and it's called a garden party. So what is the latest on the garden party tab in Ottawa? What's going on?
Well, this particular garden party that we were able to get some records on, get the receipts, it was in June of 2023. It was at Rideau Cottage. This one was Trudeau organized it. Trudeau threw it. And this time he was hanging out with the Canadian media. Now, it's kind of, unfortunately, it's more the same kind of with those affordability retreats. It is people enjoying really nice food, good drinks, and then sending the bill to taxpayers. So all told, for this particular one-day media garden party event at Trudeau's place on Rideau Cottage, taxpayers were billed $11,651. But again, like the devil is in the details. So they ordered food from 4 of Ottawa's finest eateries. They had wines and craft beer shipped in. And one detail I particularly liked, they had napkins emblazoned with gold lettering for this particular event. Food they were eating, it was, fresh handmade pasta, tostadas, tacos, shrimp sliders, tuna tartare, and salted caramel and hibiscus passion fruit ice cream served in quote-unquote eco-conscious biodegradable containers. They washed it all down with a blonde ale or an IPA craft beer. And if you weren't the beer drinking type, then they also had Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Sauvignon wines for everyone to enjoy. It sounds quite nice. The news media that was in attendance, it was people from CBC, journalists from the Globe and Mail, from the Canadian Press, from the Toronto Star, Global, CTV. So we had broadcast networks there as well. In addition to Trudeau and like his political staffers, there was other political staffers there. There was various ministers there. Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault was on the guest list.
He'd be the life of the party. I just got to say, that guy seems like a lot of fun at parties, that dude right there. He must have a lineup.
Out of the overall bill, it was about $1,300 on booze for that afternoon, and about $4,800 on the food, general catering. There were some other expenses, which is how the bill gets up to $11,651. And this particularly, as someone who used to be in the news media, I'm sure you feel the same way, Chris. Like, it drives me up the wall to hear about taxpayers, being footed the bill so politicians and journalists can, schmooze with each other and wine and dine at other people's expense. But I think the context here also really matters, because this comes at a time when, the federal government is subsidizing the Canadian media, pretty much every major player in the Canadian media, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. So just a recap or a refresher from people, because it's quite tough to keep track of all the different ways tax dollars are being shoveled at the media these days. So last November, there was $129 million earmarked for the Canadian news media. That go back all the way to 2019. There was the $595 million newspaper bailout. There was the $50 million local journalism initiative. The industry got $60 million in pandemic support. And then there was something called the $10 million special measures for journalism top up. So all told, that's more than $840 million that's been earmarked for the press in this country from the federal government. Not to mention the more than $1 billion in tax dollars the CBC gets every year. And now, to add insult to injury, they're also billing us for parties. So Trudeau can hold court with members of the Canadian Press Corps.
Sorry to put... Go ahead, Franco.
I was just going to say, I like a Bush party as much as the next guy, but like when me and my buddies want to delete a couple cold ones, I don't send the tab to the taxpayer, right? And like this like a couple things come to mind here on what's going so wrong with this. I mean, number one, like Trudeau ministers, the Liberal Party, any political party, if you want to hobnob with the media or anyone and have some fine IPAs or some pale ales or some Pilsner, or I don't know, a nice bottle of Pinot, pay for it yourself. Stop forcing struggling Canadians to pay for your parties, your shindigs, your whatever you want to call it. Okay. But number two, look, we do know that other political parties have been holding these types of garden parties, right? Now, we don't know the tab just yet, or if those tabs were paid for by the taxpayers. That's something that we're looking into. So stay tuned. But I don't care what political party it is. Stop these garden parties. Stop the party with taxpayers' money. Regardless of what party you're in, you should not be billing taxpayers to party with the media or anyone for that matter, okay? And I think also more to the point, Ryan, I'm glad you added in that extra context at the end there, is like, what kind of message does it send for politicians to be using taxpayers' money to network with the media? Not a good message, that's for sure. Like, do you think that the CBC or other mainstream news outlets that were at this garden party, do you think that they're going to report on the fact that taxpayers were billed more than $11,000 for this one-day party? I don't think so. I'm not going to hold my breath.
No, exactly. So I'm curious, and I'm not going to put you guys on the spot because you probably don't know this. I'm curious if any of these media organizations, some of whom are big media organizations, they have a ton of their own cash, if they reimbursed the Treasury at all for this, because I'm 90% sure that used to be pretty standard practice for these garden parties for the exact reason you point out, Ryan, that they don't want to be seen to be in a conflict of interest. Now, this is dating back around 20 years ago, but I'm pretty darn sure that big corporations that happen to have media and news wings attached to them would give money back to the Treasury to cover like a per head fee for however many journalists they sent. Further to your point, this just speaks volumes in the same way that, remember when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau went to the Parliamentary Press Gallery's gala a couple of years ago? And these sort of galas, number one, they used to be in-house. Nobody used to take footage of it. Now it's actually like broadcast. It's a media thing. So it's extra gross. It's no longer journalists and governments like, rizzing each other and like burning each other. It's supposed to be a roast the way it used to be back in DC. Now it's broadcast. And so we can see their speeches. And Trudeau, I'm paraphrasing, had his little speech and he said, oh, well, people accuse the media of just parroting what I want to say. Well, they'd better, because we pay them $500 million to do so. Like, gross. There was zero laughter in the room, a little bit of uncomfortable tittering. But it gets exactly to your point, Ryan, that this is an obvious conflict of interest. And hey, folks, if you don't want to see trust in media and news doing the nosedive that it is right now, like people don't trust journalists anymore. If you don't want to do that, maybe don't take government money from the taxpayer, and maybe don't go to these sort of garden parties again on the taxpayer tab. So, but Franco, how else are they going to raise money for these sort of garden parties unless they hike our taxes?
Well,
right?
Yeah. Great segue.
And that's coming up soon, right?
Yep. Great segue. But before I get into this, I actually do want Ryan to answer your question about the reimbursements, because, that was actually the first question that we had was like, okay, maybe there's reimbursements here. So Ryan, why don't you take that away?
Yeah. I just wanted to add quick. So we submitted a request with the Privy Council office to say, hey, we got these receipts. We're trying to make heads of them, wrap our heads around them. And we want to know, were tickets sold? Like, did the media have to buy tickets to this event and then therefore would have been in some way contributing to the cost? Were there any sorts of reimbursements that any of the media organizations who attended made to cover, the cost for their journalists to do this? And the Privy Council office, it took probably about 3 weeks to get a response from them at all. It was a couple of very simple questions, but it was like pulling teeth trying to get any information in this particular case. We got back a written statement. They gave no indication that there was any sort of reimbursements. They didn't directly answer the questions that we had asked, but there was no indication that any of this money had been reimbursed. Mm-hmm. And they specifically noted that, all of the expenditures were done in accordance with various, government policies on, spending money like this. So it seems to be, we gave the government every, opportunity to try and explain this or to say if there was reimbursements. They gave no indication of that. But I would also add that because of all these media organizations taking government subsidies at this point, even if they had, it would have just been shuffling taxpayer money back towards the government after they had gotten that money from the government to begin with.
Oh, that's depressing. Yeah, but you're right. I hadn't thought of that. I'm almost positive, though, 20 years ago, overhearing one of my bosses or supervisors saying something like, we can only budget for 4 people to go. Meaning the company was paying a per head thing and they weren't taking taxpayers' money back then. This is in the olden days when we used to have separation between state and journalism. It was really interesting back then. So that's depressing. All right. Do we want to talk about more depressing things on how this is no fooling, where our taxes are being hiked on April 1st? Who wants to take that one away?
Well, I'll be the rain cloud, as I so often am on the show. Yeah. So, folks, get this right. In 1 month, on the very same day, April 1, carbon tax up. Alcohol tax is up. Member of Parliament pay, you guessed it, also going up. So on the very same day that they take more money from you, they are giving themselves more of your money. Isn't that fun, right? So carbon tax, April 1, up to 17 cents a liter of gas, 21 cents a liter of diesel, 15 cents per cubic meter of natural gas. The PBO, right? Oh, they're working hard out there to hold the government accountable. It's the government's own independent, nonpartisan budget watchdog. And the PBO found that even after the rebates, the carbon tax will cost the average family up to $911 a year. Isn't that nice? Alcohol tax as well. This whole conversation could have drove you to drink and you would have been forgiven. But even then, when you go in and grab a Pilsner with the boys, a Pinot Noir with your better half, or even just a Mickey of rum after the kids have been driving you nuts all week, well, Trudeau is reaching deeper into your pocket with a 4.7% alcohol tax hike. Now, if you haven't poured yourself a stiff one, you're going to need it, because while MPs are making your life more expensive, they have inflation-proofed their own pay in a sense by giving themselves a raise. So this year's MP pay raise will range from an extra $8,000 to an extra $16,000 depending on, if they're a backbencher, if they're a minister, if they're the prime minister. So a backbencher, along with all the other perks, along with collecting dust, will be getting about a $200,000 salary after this raise, while the prime minister, after this raise, his pay will now be north of $400,000.
That is hard to swallow, and all on the same day. Now, people have asked me this. Why does it always happen on April 1st?
Yeah, beginning of the budget year for the feds. Okay. Right? That's why the carbon tax goes up, alcohol taxes go up, and their pay is going up as well.
This is why I'm asking you, because you're the economist dude. And in fact, his Twitter handle, I think it's Franconomics, which is pretty clever. A lot of normal people assume the year starts in January 1st. But for the fiscal people, their new year starts on April 1st. So that is the start of a new fiscal year. That is why it's insult to injury that it lands on April 1st or April Fool's Day. So are we seeing any, I got to put you on the spot here, Franco and Ryan. Are we seeing any major pushback coming from members of parliament as individuals or parties in the House of Commons saying, okay, guys, enough is enough. We need to stop these MP pay hikes. Maybe even have a pay cut. I don't know, dreaming in Technicolor. We need to stop the carbon tax hikes or scrap it altogether. Like, who are the big dogs on this issue?
Well, you know what? Let's just segue into our taxpayer pro tip, because this was perfect for mine. So I'm just going to go into it. So on the carbon tax, you essentially have one party that's leading the charge against the carbon tax hikes, and that's the Conservative Party. So kudos. They've been great on this issue under this since the last election. The Conservatives have been great fighting the carbon tax. They've been saying all the right things. Kudos to them on that. On the alcohol taxes, again, the Conservatives have been very good on this issue. They do not want the alcohol taxes to go up. Now, making its way in the House of Commons is now a motion from a committee to cap alcohol tax increases. So to not increase it by the full 5%-ish and to only increase it by 2%. So, all the parties are kind of starting to, well, maybe we shouldn't raise the alcohol tax by the full amount. Okay. Similar to what happened in last year's budget. Now on the pay, that's a different story. Privately, you might hear from even some of the biggest so-called taxpayer champions, we don't need another raise this year. Right. In fact, the government did stop the pay raises from going up between 2010 and 2013. That did happen. However, really, publicly, when you think about it, no party has really broken ranks as of right now to oppose the MP pay raise. Right. So the government, the Trudeau government, the Liberals, tomorrow could stop the MP pay raises. Now, it's a little harder for the opposition parties that don't control the government, like the NDP, the Bloc, the Greens, and the Conservatives. However, I'm not seeing major press conferences about this, major tweeting or other social media activity about this, or a private member's bill about this, right? All it would take, even for the opposition parties to stop the MP pay raise, would be to break ranks with the other parties and to make this a communications and political issue leading up to April 1. But I'm not seeing it. So my pro tip of the day to any of our taxpayer champions in the House of Commons or people who think of themselves as taxpayer champions, if you truly are a taxpayer champion, in addition to opposing the carbon tax and alcohol tax hikes, you better be opposing that MP pay raise.
Excellent taxpayer pro tip. Ryan, what pearls of wisdom do you have for our listeners?
Well, I just stumbled across some new data from Statistics Canada. It was released just this month, and it's basically an update on their data on trust in institutions in Canada. And one of the institutions that they look at is the media, is legacy media, and they polled for high levels of trust in the media, and the numbers are pretty damning. So across the country, we'll jump to a couple of different jurisdictions. So people who say that they have high level of trust in the Canadian media, in BC, it's 13%.
Wow.
In Ontario, it's 13%. In the prairies, it's 12%. In Atlantic Canada, it's 15%. And in Quebec, it's a little bit higher, 21%. But still, that's a damning indictment, in my opinion. Those are terrible numbers. Journalism can only function if people actually believe that, they can trust these institutions, that what they're being told is the truth. And you kind of preempted me a little bit on this, Chris, but my taxpayer pro tip is to the Canadian media. Hey, if you want to change those polling numbers, a pretty easy thing to do would be maybe don't go hobnob with the prime minister and various ministers, politicians and bureaucrats and staffers on the taxpayer tab, and drinking wine and eating fancy food and drinking craft beer, and maybe turn away the subsidies, because that is playing a major factor in why trust in the press is absolutely plummeting right now, and it should be. It's a clear conflict of interest, and quite frankly, the public shouldn't trust the press while they're on the government's payroll.
Amen. And exactly. And I would echo that. I keep a close eye on those stats too. I noticed that trust in media took like a nosedive starting in 2020 when all of this lockdown business started happening. And then it corresponded also with the wheel out of buckets of taxpayers' cash going to journalists. Not to be blunt about it, but well, duh. Like, if you are on the government payroll, if you're counting on them for your paycheck, you can't hold the government to account. Like, this is really simple, folks. And anybody who tries to baffle gab you and make it really complicated, they're just trying to snow you. Okay. Every common sense person knows that if you're on the government payroll, you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you. And even if you are that rare unicorn, okay, who somehow manages to ignore the fact that you're getting paid by this guy in government, your perception of bias is still there, because we can all see that your corporation, your company's getting paid. So it doesn't matter. Bias is the same as corruption. It's the perception of it that will sink you. And this is why we're seeing, was that a 1-digit number for high trust in media in the prairies in the West?
It was 12%, but it's failing grades across the board, and it's not even close.
Yeah, that's brutal. That is basically the employees of big media and their families plus like margin of error. Like, I'm not joking. That's around that number. So, which leads me to my taxpayer pro tip. Okay. So along with, the government paying off approved media, by the way, they have a little council. It's really cute, of government approved journalists who pick out fellow government approved journalists. And then those government approved journalists get government money. So it's even grosser than just like an across the board payout. There's like a selectivity going on there. So we've got that happening on one side, plus the CBC, plus more than $1 billion to the CBC. But on the other side of things, which leads me to my taxpayer pro tip, are things like censorship laws, like what's usually called Bill C-11, okay? And that is where the government is attempting to regulate what you can hear, see, and say online. Again, they're going to try to snow you and say, oh, no, this is just so that you can get more maple syrup recipes and Celine Dion songs on YouTube. Folks, you can't give government that kind of power. They're going to, downgrade speech they don't like. That also corresponds with something that's now on the horizon. And for folks who listen to this podcast, you've heard this term before, because the government has tried this 2 separate times. It's the so-called online harms bill. Okay, so I'm going to pick my words carefully here. The government, it sounds like it's going to table a bill that will be primarily, not sure, that will concern things like protection of children online. Every reasonable and decent person supports that. Like, no common sense decent person would oppose that. I will note there are already laws about that stuff on the criminal code. They could easily just go into those own laws and strengthen those individual laws, but they're not. What we're concerned about from a free expression, we don't use the term free speech in Canada, from a free expression perspective, is that they can also term a harm to be what they call misinformation or disinformation. Now, for anybody who's listening to this saying, oh, well, we don't want, Vladimir Putin disinforming us in our election in Moose Jaw, that can't be, okay, fine. But do you really want Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and cabinet ministers like Stéphane Guilbeault to decide what is and is not misinformation in Canada? Because when we use the term carbon tax, they get really mad, right? When we found out that they were thinking about a pickup truck tax, they were super mad. They called it misinformation. Folks, think about it. Do you want the government deciding what is disinformation and misinformation and possibly muzzling you in your free expression online? And here's why this is important. Because if you can't express yourself freely, you cannot hold government to account. Period. Government will work in its own little vacuum, and you'll stay home and be a good little silent taxpayer. You don't want that. So I will leave the taxpayer pro tip at that. Folks, pay attention to this bill that is probably going to be tabled soon. Phone your MP across party lines. You tell them, yes, I understand what it's called, but there's this little pill in there that could affect my free expression, and I want you to take that out. So folks, if you have any questions about this stuff, or if you want to sign a petition or order, a pushback type t-shirt, go to our website, taxpayer.com. You can sign all sorts of petitions there for whatever issue you want. And it's also a good way for you to help fight for taxpayers.